So hello, everyone. We're going to get going in a couple minutes as folks kind of pop in. Hey, Allison. Hey, Katie. Um, so feel free to, get your beverage of your choice before we get going. And we'll get started here in a little while. Here we go. I kind of wish I'd thought to do this. I don't know if you can get liquor delivered. Oh, there we go. Well done. I don't know if you can get liquor delivered like in Ohio or Idaho, but you can in Tucson. Like you can get margaritas delivered. There's a couple friends of mine just had some margaritas like showed up randomly to my house, which I then passed on to Maddie, who's here in the audience at the right moment in her thesis defense. But I wish I'd thought of just like sending us all like giant margaritas, which I've been well ahead of the game. That way you get a very loose conversation, which might be a plus.
For sure.
So I guess we might as well get started and people can come in as they are. We got some folks here. I recognize a lot of the names and I'm happy to see y'all here. And folks I don't know, hello. My name is Ander Monson. I'm the editor of Essay Daily and the founder of Essay Daily. And one thing we decided that we wanted to do was to try to create more spaces for connection and conversation. I mean, that's kind of our raison d'etre from the first place, is to try to have conversations about contemporary nonfiction and particularly about the essay. So since we're all on Zoom, I thought it would be fun to try to do this series of salons in which we bring in writers that interest us to talk about subjects that interest us, and in front of y'all and with y'all here. And this is the second one of these, I think, right? Second one? Yeah, we did one before. And there'll be just a quick note. We'll have the third one will be coming up on November 30th, which will feature Katie Standifer, who's here in the audience, as well as Kelly Sundberg, coming in to talk about publishing an essay that sort of gets some buzz out there. You might get some agent contacts, but how do you get from interest in the one essay to publishing the book? And so we'll be talking about that on November 30th. And you're all welcome to come and join us. I would love to have you. It should be fun to talk about. We may try to add one more correspondent or panelist to that. Not sure yet, but we'll have Katie and Kelly for the first, for sure. So the other thing to mention, this is being recorded. So we welcome your questions in the chat or on camera if you prefer, but try to keep yourself muted while we're chatting until we get to the point where conversation kind of opens up a little bit. The format of this is that I'm just going to briefly introduce Bethany and Sarah and ask them to each to read for 5-10 minutes. And then we're going to talk about the form of the essay and kind of assembling the collection, which I know was a sort of concern for both of these writers. Working also with the press and the designers and all of that. So, but your comments and questions are welcome whenever you have them as we go through this. This is designed to be kind of a free-flowing conversation, not like a really well thought out presentation. So the bar is low when it comes to really thought out presentation, but the bar is high when it comes to conversation. So we're happy to have you with us. And I guess I will ask Sarah to read for us a little bit first, because I'm going in opposite alphabetical order. And those of us that have like M last names always are just kind of in the middle of whatever order it is anyway. And so I was even like in school when, sometimes they would go backwards alphabetical order to like make it fair for the kids with the W's, but the M's are always just stuck in the middle. And I don't know if this is a feeling that you both have here, but it's a feeling that I have. So we're going to start with the M's. And I'll just say Sarah is the author of Bright Archive, most recently, which you can see up here behind me, a book that came out from Rescue Press. And it's a really wonderful book of really weird essays. They're not even that weird, but they look weird. Like they present as weird when you first kind of encounter them. And Sarah, like Bethany, is is an alum of the MFA program in nonfiction at the University of Arizona, where I teach and where I had both of you as students, like way back in the day. And I'm really excited to be able to help kind of like bump and celebrate the new books that you have come out. So Sarah, do you want to read for a little bit? And then we'll go from there, and we'll have Bethany after you.
Sure, thank you. Am I coming in clear? Good. I like that we would all, Ander, Bethany, and I would have all had our lockers next to each other. Were we in the same high school class? I'm going to read from an essay called Foul Shoots on the Archive Downriver, and it looks like this in the book. It goes, it's you have to turn it sideways to read it, which is how I'll read it now. It's an essay that parallels the history of the laundry chute with the history of the Mississippi River. And I'm going to start in the middle. My best friend Meg steadies her knee to make a step up for my hiking boot. Let's not get lost now, she says, the words tight with instant coffee and transgression. She looks past her shoulder into rural Mississippi and tips my bottom half over the chain link. I land askew, past the fence on a beveled slab of concrete that starts ringing hollowly. The sky is netted with branches. Cold cement stretches out on either side. A little blood starts to pill at my kneecap as I sit up in what looks like the bowl of a baby doll-sized skate park. Its gray half pipes rise no higher than my knees and dip irregularly along the rims. They make the same bizarre undulating shape I've been tracing on my laptop screen for months. When I stand and follow the shape into the brush, the bowl balloons wider, like an amoeba. It takes 3 steps to walk into the rest of the abandoned Mississippi River model, a miniature version of the watershed that the U.S. Army Corps carved and abandoned here outside Jackson 70 years ago. And now Meg and I are trespassing. Cartographer and artist Dennis Wood defines shadowed spaces as necessary places of refuge for deviant acts within every culture. Deviant acts, as Wood defines them, include a variety of common behaviors, everything from general hanky-panky to voting for the villainous party to dumping toxic waste, similar only in that someone would prefer to keep each one hidden. Wood's shadowed spaces are edge areas that thrive in the bottom of unworked quarries. They're the spaces underneath bridges, spotted with guano. If a river is the lifeline, a crease at the center of a hand, then a watershed is the palm and 5 fingers extending. It is impossible to describe the first phenomenon without the rest. A watershed funnels snowmelt on a slight decline. Before the river becomes a river, it is water threading wheat furrows, filling lots and flushing alleys before making its way, in many small batches, all the way down to a bank. When a river floods, it ruins a city by erasing its edges. Those barriers set up between the sewer and the roadway, the pasture and the schoolyard, a city's dump and its downtown markets. A watershed makes lived spaces look, occasionally, in newspapers and on television, as if they were stewing in the river. In 1895, the New York Times reported that a janitor had discovered a small human skull near the opening to the chute in a West 46th Street tenement house. The writer noted that the skull had evidently been boiled at some time and was believed to belong to Susie Martin, who had gone missing when her mother sent her out to gather coal, and whose body had been found near West 39th Street a few days after her disappearance without its head. In 1927, a long time before Meg and I drove to Mississippi, after months of heavy snowfall that was followed by rain in Minnesota and Wisconsin, the Mississippi River flooded its watershed for 23,000 miles. Every city with enough money had built levees, directing more water towards the main channel. But a decade later, the lumber barons had cut away the great forests lining the banks, and industrial farming drained the prairies, which for centuries had functioned like a sponge for river water. Without the root systems to trap in the floodwaters, they spread across the plains, scouring fields, reshaping valleys, and surrounding great hills where lone houses stood that would someday be ours. Herbert Hoover called it the greatest peacetime calamity in America's history. That calamity inspired the Flood Control Act of 28, which called on the Army Corps of Engineers to defend America's citizens against their most central waterway. The Army Corps' first real solution would be a scale model of the entire Mississippi watershed, built on 200 acres, a portion of the real watershed outside Jackson, Mississippi. The first laundry chutes turn up in American newspapers and advertisements around 1880, an era that Mira Engler, scholar of rejected landscapes, has called the time of diverting waste to the public. Engler says this era is marked by the early control of waste due to Major's discoveries that, at long last, linked waste to the spread of disease via pathogens too small for doctors to see with naked eyes. Florence Nightingale had already encouraged divisions in public hospitals that moved used linens away from areas designated for caregiving. She argued that laundry should never be processed near patients. Nothing answers so well as foul linen chutes, Nightingale wrote. These should be built in the wall. The best material for them is glazed earthenware piping that can be flushed. In the very same era, Midwestern newspapers and farming journals ran campaigns for the drainage of malarial wetlands to create the miracle of brand new farmland, a landscape that no longer absorbed water, and newly relating ideas about productive land and waste. A week before spring break, I booked the last room in Jackson, drove to Tennessee, and talked Meg into driving 12 more hours in gray weather to walk around an 8-mile gutter. Our friendship, built across trips like this one, began when one of us convinced the other to skip a class or a shift, and on every occasion we both wound up deeply carsick. I always thought talking was easier in the car, but Meg preferred the quiet and the view. I drove. In Memphis, she took a turn at the wheel and described that September when she dated first a roadie, then a rhetorician, and got ordained on her back porch while holding a breakfast burrito and a joint. 2 hours outside Jackson, the western sky bruised itself green and then peach, and I heard tornado sirens for the first time since I was a kid. Our hotel was dressed like a mid-grade hunting lodge with maple leaf carpet and a free cocktail hour. No whiskey, no limes. We took lemons and joined a set of Jesuits and a state highway patrol conference near the gas fire. The next morning, we shared oversweet muffins with the business casuals and open carries. We crossed the city limits in boots and neon tights. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Sarah. That was great. Yes, the applause icon. I love it. So let me briefly introduce you to Bethany Maile, who is an essayist of the West. The West is her subject, one of her many subjects. In particular, Idaho, in particular, Eagle, Idaho, a place that is not probably known to most people outside of Bethany's sort of engagement with it, and made me care about Idaho a lot more than I expected to, or think about Idaho any more than I expected to at any point in my life. And her new book is Anything Will Be Easy After This, which has sort of after the title essay about like the world of rodeo queens in Idaho, came out from University of Nebraska Press. And we're really excited to have both it out and Bethany here with us this evening / afternoon, depending where you are. So welcome. You want to read for a little bit?
I do. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be with you all. I'm going to jump in and just read from the title chapter, which, as Ander said, is about rodeo queening. The only thing we really need to know is that this chapter uses side notes, which function sort of similarly to footnotes, but you'll know I'm in a side note when I say side note. Right, I'm going to pick up in a section titled Contestants. Abby Bowler is thin as a rope with a long sloping face. A mass of Barbie blonde hair falls past her shoulders, and she always sports false eyelashes. Abby is from Ingham, Idaho, a town of 206 families. She wants to be Miss Rodeo, Idaho because she is committed to projecting the image of a wholesome all-American girl with high moral values and character. Abby speaks with a high, thin voice and seems genuinely, undeniably sweet, though this might be a result of the eyelashes, which she bats masterfully. Casey Quibb holds the Meridian Lions Rodeo Queen title and radiates confidence. She speaks loudly with a deep, rasped voice and is clearly a seasoned competitor. She never stops smiling. In fact, she smiles so constantly it can look pained. She is also always posing, standing heel to toe, hands tucked behind her back, and when she walks, her gait is some strange combination of delicate modeling and graceless strength. She is short and broad and looks really strong. She is solid, straight to the hips and waist and rippled with muscle. Casey wants to be Miss Rodeo, Idaho because she will, she says, be a role model for young girls and give them a future filled with hope and desire. I could help more people understand rodeo and how it can be an exciting event for the family as it captures the imagination and nostalgia of the cowboy era in America. Side note, consider the words Casey uses: imagination, nostalgia. Here we have one of the few, perhaps only suggestions that the cowboy era no longer exists in Idaho. It seems the MRI folks believe Idaho is still defined by a thriving cowboy culture, regardless of its depleted cattle industry, vanishing farm fields, boarded up slaughterhouses, and quickly sprouting shopping malls. Not to mention that MRI itself only had 3 contestants this year, that ghastly low. Courtney Gilbert is visibly young and visibly nervous. Like the other queens, she is all smiles all the time, but beneath hers lies a hint of undeniable terror. She keeps her hands in her lap, as is advisable, but her fingers never stop dancing. She is a natural deep blonde and wears less makeup than the other 2 girls. Courtney stands out for her simple, relatively plain styling. She wears too bright blush, but no foundation, and freckles dapple her nose. She's thin, and her shirts haven't been tailored as carefully as the other girls, and beneath her rhinestones ooze visible clumps of glue. She's 18 and claims to be a cowgirl with many talents. Courtney wants to be Miss Rodeo, Idaho because she says it would be an honor and one I'm going to work hard for, to be a part of Idaho's history and knowing I did many helpful things to help others. She also wants to become a psychologist and hypnotist because what better way to aid her fellow man? They all tease their hair, which is a given. After the trademark chopping wave, rodeo queens are known more for their enormous barrel curls than anything else. They always, regardless of liberally applied perfume, smell like Aquanet. They are all from Southern Idaho. They all have college aspirations. They've all competed as queens before. They are all supremely kick-ass on a horse. Collectively, they barrel race, goat tie, pole bend, and train horses. They are undeniably tough. The queens have been double kicked in the chest, the side, and the back. They have been bucked off and rolled on. They have been bitten. They have bitten horses back. Side note, I learned the best way to cure a horse's biting problem is to bite it back hard on the tender, meaty curve of its muzzle. They have punched misbehaving horses straight across the face. I don't know why I've read that so many times, but for some reason it just sounded like extra funny. Straight across the face, they have been flung from the saddle. They have landed hard. Side note, as the queens roll up their sleeves and trace scars, I keep quiet. I've been bucked and nipped, certainly, but I know our war stories are not the same. In a pissing contest, regardless of severity of wound, I lose for this reason. All my injuries are my fault. I raced a hungry Arabian through an alfalfa field, was bucked, and then crashed on the saddle's horn. I broke an arm after jumping a horse saddled in 2 long stirrups. I chipped a bone, here the most embarrassing and most recent, after rolling from a still standing, loose cinched horse. These girls have seen the same bruises and bangs, but their animals were wild, new to bridles and reins and a spur's stab to the flank. Maybe this feeling of inadequacy is more deeply seated than I'd like to admit. That old boyfriend of mine, the alfalfa farmer, had a sister-in-law who was an ex-queen. She never broke costume, always sporting snug jeans and big buckles and stiff curled hair. She talked about breaking horses and punching cattle, and I cowered in her presence. Able only to ride trail horses drained of their zest, I felt useless. In the company of the queen, I was a woman impotent in all things Western. And we'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. So I guess the first place I'd like to start, and I've got a series of questions that I'm happy to kind of wade into. Though if folks have them, you're welcome to pose them in the chat, and we can kind of get to them as things occur to you. But I'd like to ask each of you to talk a little bit about form and how it works in your books. It is more obvious. I mean, if you look at Sarah's book, like, I mean, every essay just looks like fairly crazy on the page. If you're used to just reading prose, like that's not, I mean, it is prose, but it's prose like in shapes and kind of like in different directions. And there's like knots that sort of like, and sort of strands of string. It's very visual. It's a very visual book and very unusual in a lot of ways. So form is inherently a subject for that book. That's a little bit less so for Bethany's. Although, I mean, we see a lot of play with form, especially in the essay that you read from, which has, as you put them, side notes, which is a term I've never heard before. And they used to be in footnote form in the version I've read before. But there's also like a way in which the essays are using other kinds of forms, even if they're not visual forms. Like they tend to be segmented often into like sort of subtitled chunks, like in the Lady Antebellum essay and the Wild Ones. So they're not just kind of straight prose. And I just would like to ask both of you to talk about your relationship with form and how I don't know, what does that look like in this book, or what does it look like when you go to the page?
Do you want to go first, Sarah? I mean, no. Okay. All right. I'm happy to. Yeah, those are sort of the three. If you were to flip through my book, you would see the most obvious physical formal considerations in those three chapters. And The Wild Ones, which is an essay about Mustangs, and My Lady Antebellum essay, which is an essay about the band, both had really, like, they were so idea driven, and there was this really sort of unwieldy logic about them. And it's a book about obsession, right? Oh, there it is. It's a book that's very much about the things that obsess us, but then also seeing that obsessive brain play on the page. But in those two chapters where I sort of chunk them in to different sections via headings, I needed to impose a kind of exoskeleton to order the logic. That was especially true in the Lady Antebellum piece, which does a lot of different things. It's a personal essay, it's a band profile, it's an album review. So my headings also became a way to kind of create a hierarchy for all those different things. Whereas in The Wild Ones, those headings were really about guiding us through the logic, because I felt so much like counterpoint, counterpoint, and pivoting back and forth between the two, that I felt like I was kind of, the thinking was ricocheting around. So I wanted to create a system that would contain it and guide the reader through that thinking. But the headings don't function necessarily in exactly the same way. In The Wild Ones, that essay felt like maybe the saddest in the book. And I tried to be really playful through this book, and there's a little bit of like humor laced throughout. And that was hard to find a way to do that when I was talking about like wild horses being sold or, stored in slaughterhouses. So the headings also take on like this tonal shift, so I can have a little bit of like variation in voice through them. So I was trying to cut a little levity in. With the Rodeo Queens, it was really important to me that I yield the stage to them in a way, so that I could exist removed from them, because that was really my experience with them, was just being very humbled as a certain type of Western woman, right? Like they are supremely kick-ass on a horse and I can barely ride them. And I wanted the form to reflect that. So I wanted to be distanced from them. I wanted to be set, like left to their center stage. And initially when they were footnotes, I wanted to exist literally inferior to them on the page. And then for reasons that we'll probably brush on later through the publishing process, they got shifted around, but it was still really important to me that there be a distancing and a removal, a physical space between me and them.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you talk about that. I was just thinking that often, I think because of the way I talk about essays and I teach about essays, often I go to what is formal and can be identified visually as formal, but I was thinking a lot about the essay as form as I was reading Bethany's book, and I was thinking about the little titles, subtitles, momentary titles throughout. I was kind of thinking about them functioning like in the editorial way. Sometimes like a second voice will come in a country song and be like, this is the good part, or like 3 days later. And they are like, they really have the essaying gesture behind them. Like when you're telling us like, this is why this isn't important, or why none of this matters. I'm looking at that section right now. And so like, I think that is really, the essay as form is like the form I care about most. And I think these are really plugged into that gesture, or like sometimes we might talk about the essay as a verb, and they are very much essaying in their title, as in they're like really keen inspection of Westernness and place and culture. So I'm interested in that, talking about form in that way too. I guess I think the question was like, what's our relationship to form? I was asked a question. Someone was asking me a question that I often get the other day, and it was, what's more important, the form or the content? And I tried to give an answer that was like, this is why form is and this is why content is, but both of my answers like redirected us toward form. And I think it is true that it's often the easiest thing to talk about because it's most visual and most unusual and most challenging, most recognizable for the reader. But I think what interests me about the visual essay as a mode is that the part of it that is unusual or strange or challenging and visual is really there to enhance what is essayistic about it. And so I think I'm thinking of them as united in that way. And so my answer will always be both, or like I can't see them as separate, but also I'm most interested in essays that use something like a little addition, like a side note or a header to accelerate or clarify what the writer is thinking and how and in what way they're thinking. So that's what interests me about form of the essay.
So I don't know if you're watching the chat. Allison chimed in with a Denise Levertov line. I don't know if I agree with that Levertov line. I might want to beef a little bit with Denise. I guess I'm kind of like tipping my hand a little bit. And Sarah, like you were saying that like form is, the visual form for you is a way of enhancing the kind of essaying or the essayistic aspects, which does suggest, I mean, what Allison sort of citing there, right? I mean, that the form comes maybe not secondarily, but is like designed to perform a thing on the page that is already kind of happening in your mind. Is that a fair gloss of what what you do?
I think it more like extends and clarifies it, and is sometimes able to communicate it in a way that the text itself can't. So yeah, I think it's amazing that you brought up that quote, Allison. I have the second book that I have coming out next year. That is the epigraph to the book. And I think of it as a facetious epigraph. But I have it attributed to Charles Olson. So we should talk and figure out who it was that said that first or most often.
We should talk about it, and I'll have to look, because Levertov's essay, where I'm probably poorly paraphrasing, is a response to an essay by Robert Creeley. And I forgot what he said about the relationship between form, but she was like, no, it's blah, blah, blah. But of course, they are both children of Olson in a certain way. Well, this is a conversation you and I need to have. But I'm stoked that you have that that epigraph for your next book. That's very cool.
I'm just interested in that idea, and I think that like the book is supposed to be like maybe proving that wrong, but also, I don't know, continuing that thinking. I don't think it's necessarily anti that idea, but
No.
Well, but so like when my formal considerations were all really after I had drafted things, right? And I suspect, Sarah, that might not be the case for you, right? Like, do you start with form and then that branches into things, or where in the process does it come in for you?
Yeah, so I do, I've come to sort of think of my really tedious processes as like the way I write, and a sort of like forcing myself to write. So sometimes I write in Photoshop, which I don't recommend, but it does makes you really think about your words and sacrifice them for anything. So does not allow you to put the language first, or to make it seem like the most important thing, because it can go more easily than other elements. But yeah, I think it's just depends on the essay. Both the log cabin essay and the nest essay happened for me after a period when I hadn't been writing at all, like for several months, no writing whatsoever. And I think I'd been considering maybe some of the ideas that were in them, and it was like the image of the form of the text that arrived in my head. And then I was sort of able to sit down, and as if I had like a series of boxes, like sort of write the essay all at once in the form I had imagined, and then it changed, and the form would like clarified and got better over time. But so those would be ones in which the form came first. But all of the others, like the Mississippi, the Pearl essay changed so many times. The one I just read from has had 4 different forms, and I think it's more like they're really interrelated. And as the text needs something or needs to be displayed somewhere, the form adjusts for that. And then as I need to hang the text, the form has to be horizontal rather than vertical, the text has to change for that. So both. And it's often very tedious, I think, is my answer.
I think that it isn't like an afterthought for you or something you apply after you've written like this, 15-page Word document suggests how central it is, and not this like auxiliary thing you've pasted on at the end, right? And that's sort of what I'm like hearing in your process.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
I mean, so for Bethany, I guess maybe to come back to the question before. So for you, it really is a way of, you've written the text and are trying to enact certain aspects of things that are happening in the text, in the case of like the Rodeo Queen's essay, or trying to like inject like a different kind of voice or kind of like controlling mind in the essay through like the subtitles, the way that they kind of work.
Yeah, I think largely in this book, but also it's like always, I think it's just about what is the most interesting and powerful and efficient way to carry us forward in the piece and to like land us in that big idea or that big truth that we want to sort of peel back. And sometimes it takes footnotes for me, sometimes it takes headings. I think in an earlier draft of this book, Andrew, you might remember, I had a lot of parentheticals going on, which was another way for me to, it was like another mode of obsession for me. Like I wanted to like break down, kind of like get a deconstruct this way, like even at the word level, like how can I interrogate even what this word means? And I would offer kind of like an immediate parallel definition or question. If we say like ideal, question mark, Western, and it was kind of like built that way. And those got scaled way back, but design.
Why did they get scaled way back?
That's a good question. This is one of those questions that I feel like is extra tricky when you wait almost a decade to publish your book. But I think it had to do with accessibility. I think a lot of people, I got a couple notes from editors that they just found them not charming in the way that I wanted them to be, which is, I felt like that was maybe a fair note. And I think at some point I was negotiating how many directions I could pull the attention, because I felt like a really kind of lateral book, and that I had really long chapters, and then I had this downward direction into the footnotes. I was chunking the chapters through these headings, and then even on the line level, they were sort of like impregnated with these parentheticals. So it was really getting pulled in a lot of different directions in a way that I thought was interesting, and talking about I was trying to create the sensation of watching that mind ping pong through its thinking. But I think at some point it might have been one too many directions, and it got a little crowded.
Maybe this is a time to segue to Maddie's point. It's interesting to me to hear you talk about like these, which were originally written as essays and then kind of became chapters. And I don't know if there's a difference between those two things, but maybe this is a way of actually asking Maddie's question. At what point, Is it just terminology for you, calling them chapters and no longer essays? Did they change and become more of a chapter and less of an essay at some point?
Sarah, do you want to jump on that, or I'm happy to field it?
I think, will you talk about the chapters idea too? Because I think I'm curious about that terminology and yeah, just what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think I do use them interchangeably now that the book is out, but maybe not in the most careful or deliberate way. I think maybe it has something to do with like chapters can be essays, but not all essays can be chapters, right? So I think there's this standaloneness that's suggested in the essay. And certainly when I wrote this as my thesis at Arizona, by and large, you could extract each section, we'll call them chapters for now, and they would have been very similar to what I'd published as standalone essays. But part of the process of getting this ready for publication was smoothing the chapters together, the essays together into something that sat more comfortably well. So there was more of like a joint beginning from where one begins and one ends. And so I think that smoothing process has made them more chapter-like in my mind, where if you extracted them now, they wouldn't necessarily stand alone. So yeah, it feels to me like when I think of essay, I think of something more standalone. When I think of chapter, I think of something that must be housed in a larger body.
I mean, was that a conscious decision that you made at some point? I remember you mentioned at the reading, the UA alum reading, or maybe in the colloquium after, that like part of your revision process was basically adding 20% more memoir to everything, which makes it feel probably more like a chapter and less like an essay, if that's like a sort of recurring feature that is sort of smoothing things toward a sense of wholeness.
Yeah, in terms of revision, that was where the bulk of it was for me with this project. And I had this sort of realization when I was looking at the whole manuscript that I had this really memoir-y opening where I'm leaving Boston and coming back to Idaho. And I had this really memoir-y ending where I'm in Tucson and I'm getting ready to leave again. And I have all these question marks around like how to engage with the land and where does that leave me now? But in between those two really like memoir pieces, those bookends, were these chunks that really felt like essays still. They felt like these standalone pieces that were tied in theme and consideration, but weren't really smoothed together in a way. So I cut like 20% because they were already very long chapters. And then I rebuilt that 20% in that way where like, when you see me emerge in that memoir-y way, it's usually in the beginnings and ends of those essays so that you can see me fluidly moving from place to place and gradually growing from the person who's leaving Boston to the end of the book, the person who's about to leave Tucson as well.
I love hearing about that. And I would be so curious to hear more about like what it means to like transition one essay nicely into the next one, because I feel that happened in the book. And Bethany, I think something else that I loved noticing while I was reading in another way that I feel like, I guess I want to know if this was like added or at what point these little, sometimes my students call them Easter eggs. I think I'm not sure what that means, but they're like little hidden gems that like tie one essay to the next and remind me consistently that this is a part of a larger book. Like I'm thinking about one is where you reference in Anything Will Be Easy, the chapter, you reference the outfits of Lady Antebellum while you're describing the rodeo queen's outfit, and then you like research if the singer of that group was ever a rodeo queen, and it's just so clear that so much of your consciousness is like relating these many parts of Westernness. And there's like a larger one you make happen where you're sometimes likening like the fashioning of a kind of Westernness, like the ways these suburbs are fashioned, that you're critiquing very well in other parts. So I was just wondering if that, like, did you go in later and add the antebellum nod, or is that also part of the connections?
No, I added them later because when Ander was my thesis director, he told me to, and it was a good note. Yeah. And I think Allison used to always say, like, look for the connective tissue in the pieces. And so she'd sort of trained me to do that in an essay way. And then of course, like, there was so much pleasure once Ander reminded me that was like a possibility on the book level as well, because I think what a lot of nonfiction writers love to do is find the echoes, right? Like we're just looking for unexpected repetitions. Where are we seeing these patterns? So that was, I think I did one whole pass that was just where can I tease out things? Where can I build more of that connective tissue? But you do it so much in your book as well. And I noticed it a lot around place and home. And I don't know, you know, I knew I wanted to write a book about like Idaho and like place and identity were my buzzwords. And I don't know that I necessarily expected to find so much of the Midwest in your book. And I was so delighted. I was like, oh, I think we actually were both really concerned with the places where we came from. And I don't want to steer the direction too far if there's anything else we want to talk about. But I would love to hear you talk about how that idea of place emerged for you, if that was something that kept cropping up or you were intentional about seeking it out.
Yeah, I think it was like really an accident. I think we've talked about this too before, how, you know, everyone's like, I sort of see now most first books, whether they're a novel or a collection of poetry, is sort of like the who am I exploration and like, what am I doing? So even in this book of wild forms, I think I was, you know, we figured out you and I were both like flying home from Tucson every so often to go and like research our homes where we'd lived for so long, like as if we needed more time there or something. So yeah, that gesture was really present. And I think it's just also about this being my first book. So to kind of talk about the way, I think I really do think of these as essays, and I feel like this was finished when I felt like I was done with the thinking about these shared subjects and objects in some way. And then the real fun of like compiling it or thinking about the architecture of individual pieces and the architecture of the whole book was more, I think it was a little more like how a poet thinks about sequencing a collection of poems, in terms of like what the experience is, how a motif develops, what information someone needs earlier that might not be linear but will feed into a later discussion. And I think too, some beautiful, like I love having conversations with people who are maybe frustrated when they open this book and then we're like, okay, like, okay, I can read it. Especially like I've had two colleagues at work. I work with a lot of visual artists who wouldn't call themselves readers. And two of them have said something to me like, I was like really happy to get your book and I tried reading it. And like I was so frustrated with the first essay, Sarah. I was like, oh, she's making me flip it around. I can't believe I have to do this. And then they said when they got to the second essay, which is like, I would consider one of the wilder shapes, the lemon, they were like, oh, this is easy. Like, oh, I can do this, you know, because I guess the hurdle of the flipping like made the rest of it feel more intuitive or simple. It's that idea of like the essay or the book teaches you how to read it in the first section, and then you have those skills going forward. So yeah, I guess I'm thinking more about that now. That was Carol Pagel of Rescue Press really helped me with the ordering. So she had some insights I didn't. She also has this idea of this book as taking she calls it the Indiana Jones format, which models the first Indiana Jones movie where, you know, like it opens with all this action, and like he's running from the giant boulder and then he's like switching out the bag of sand, and then it stops and goes back to his work as a professor and like his life. So it's like action then into the like intimate personal details, and everything you learn about him as a human is like then framed through that action. So she was thinking about this book in that way because it starts with something that's a little more like journalistic and about the outside world, which I've only learned recently. So you learn about your book all the time. Those are just some of the things I'm thinking about essays as becoming a book.
Let me jump in briefly to that, just to mention that I just got Carol's book in the mail when I went into like our pandemic afflicted office, and I'm like, oh, something's cool is in the mailbox. Like, how nice. And I was reading, and that first essay in her book is really right. I mean, it's like, it's dense. It's like one paragraph. Like there's no paragraph breaks in it. And so immediately I'm like, ah, shit. It felt like a little bit more of a grind. And then I sort of like fell into the rhythm of it and sort of understood why it was doing that. But it's again, like a book that starts with a somewhat challenging formal decision. And then the second essay is easier after that. Then the third one, which is the kind of like really fragmented one, becomes another kind of work. And so, I mean, I do think that your book it starts out, it's not like it kind of like slowly slides into like visual weirdness. Like it starts out big. And so there is something to that. And I think that kind of connects to what Kim was sort of suggesting. And I'm wondering if you could talk, if the two of you would talk a little bit about that idea of demand, like, is it of how demanding it may be to readers and like, is that something that you tried to mediate or tried to like counter, or do you not buy that it's more demanding at all? I will sort of add briefly that I was teaching the log cabin square essay in one of my undergrad classes, and either they were puzzled by it, but a lot of my students were really delighted by it. They're like just not used to having to play with the thing on the screen and this one you have to rotate to read. Like I just gave them like the link to the diagram publication they can just click on. But like I found them to be surprisingly open to the play in a way that normally I would have had to like, I don't know, convince them of.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in what Bethany was saying, which is that any instance of like the title is really for the purpose of like driving the reader through the unpeeling. You said I really liked that at the end. And I think that I also think of the titles as like part of the unpeeling, like each one was like picking a little further. But yeah, I think to Kim's question about the challenge of and how it demands things from the reader, I think it does. Like, I think definitely. And I think it's something I want to do. Like I want, what was it? One time I was in a class with Eric LeMay, and we all had to decide what object represented our writing, or what type, what's like a metaphor for what our writing is like. And I was like, what's that thing called where like you have to like run over hurdles and like crawl through the mud and like go up one? It was like an obstacle course. I was like, yeah, that's what I think my work is. But I also think a lot about like something Ander talked about when we were at Arizona about the cheese and the maze. Like you want to make the maze for the writer, but you want to leave them cheese. Like they have to, if they're not going to get cheese, they're going to stop doing the maze. Like, why would you do it? So I think a lot of the fun I have with making visual forms is like, how much work is the reader willing to do? And is that work always inviting them as a collaborator? Because that's what I want really, is for someone to be engaging with the essaying, the thinking. And so the forum is an invitation to do that, and an invitation to make choices and have pauses and be in control. Plus, what are some rewards along the way? So is that like the satisfaction of like the turning, or is it how you're rewarded with secrets when you flip upside down and you're like getting to the dirt of things? I think that balance is always something that I love to play with, and why it takes me so long to finish an essay, because it's hard to find where the reader isn't having to do too much work, that they're pushed out and they're not getting enough cheese, or like where the form is still working to make the ideas come across. So I think that's why and so in an essay like the lemon, I didn't always have numbers. Maybe no one cares about that, but I didn't used to have numbers like attached to each section, like 1, 2, 3. But I know there's a reader out there who's like, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm in 4B. That's like what they know. And I think that's important, because I'm trying to talk to a whole range of people. Maybe someone who wants to spin the thing, and maybe someone who's like, I don't know if I have time for that. And so, yeah, I think work is definitely something I want, but I think there's a reward involved.
And I just want to say, like, the reward for me is when I see you, as I often do, always do, when I make the connections between the form and the meaning. It's like, oh, I get why we're doing this. And it's like, do people not like to solve puzzles? Do we not like to create order or to feel that sense of accomplishment? And I also am just curious about who do you get a lot of feedback about the turning? Because I just did it and it wasn't that hard. Like it was fine. That feels like a very low bar.
I think the book just came out, so a lot of people like would read the first one, so maybe that's why. But I think I had never thought that, I just had never considered that it is the only essay that makes you go like this. None of the others I guess the river is the, yeah, you
And-
do you have to do this, but
You
it's a little
like
bit,
a log cabin, right?
yeah, but that one comes out is like the whole,
Yes.
like a picnic blanket. So yeah, I guess I have so far.
Yeah, but are you piecing out when you put them in order, I guess? I mean, I love what you said about the Indiana Jones opening. Because I think that's so true. And it's like part of the book proposal writing process as well, which I'm very mired in. But when you're ordering these, was it about accessibility? Was it about like where are the obstacles? And do you have a scale of like which of these essays design-wise are more accessible than others?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the answer is a lot different when they're in the form of a book than when they're on screen or in like a 8.5 by 11 printout document, which is what I thought of as my writing for so long, you know, when you're not putting it in places or when it's online. And so a scale of which one is most accessible, that's so fun. I don't know. I guess in terms of the book, these all had to change. One way they all had to become a book is they all had to agree to be bound, and then they all had to change in order to do that. So that means that the log cabin is like least accessible. Like I think some people like it, they use it as a bookmark, it falls out, they never find it again, they put it on their wall. And I think Carol Pagel also talks about how that's the piece that's like, that's the trickster essay in the book. Because it's like, I'm not actually part of this. Like, this isn't really a book. And I think there's that impulse is present here too. But something else I'm thinking about is, so the last essay is a chunk of text. If you haven't seen the book yet, it's just a, I mean, it's just a paragraph. It has, and it's double justified. So there's no indentation on either side except for the ones I choose. And someone asked me recently, they were like, oh, is that that's the only formless essay, it has no form. I was like, oh, and they were like, well, it's because you're asking the reader to pick the form at the end. And I was like, I like that. Yeah, I guess that's a different type of like invitation or accessibility. I feel like I'm talking a lot, so I'll wrap that up. But yeah, I like that question a lot. What about you, Bethany? Are you thinking about form as ever adding challenge for the reader? Or what does add challenges?
I mean, I think my length can sometimes, and then yeah, like in the instance of the parentheticals where I wasn't getting enough, like people weren't satisfied enough by them for them to earn their keep. So yeah, it happens.
Maybe that's a good way to think about turning to Maddie's question from a little bit ago also, is like, how did the books come together in the order that they did? I mean, I think I've sort of, I have one possible reason why, like Sarah opens with the essay that she opens with, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like the challenge of having to, I mean, was it purely, I mean, I heard you talking, Bethany, a little bit about the memoir is like the kind of arc of the book. And so that probably helps to organize it. Sarah, I don't know if you want to address that question. Like, I mean, how did you find like these orders, these architectures that they're in?
Sorry, I'm talking about horizontalness in the chat. Bethany, you should go first.
Yes, I think the guiding principle for me was, even before I did that 20% revision, making it more memory, I knew at its heart it was going to be about plotting my disenchantment with the presiding story of this place. So I needed to organize, and I'm just putting them down on the ground, like where am I most charmed, most susceptible, most complicit, and where am I the most turned off? So it's like you see like me really dissatisfied at the gun range at the end of the essay, me very turned off by representation of Western women in film at the end of the book. So you see this kind of like the shift mounting. But there was also, I had to then, it was back and forth. I had to take those essays and sometimes manipulate them to be more disenchanted if they were coming near the end, because like I knew I had this very long title essay. I mean, anything will be easy after this. The chapter is real long. I think it's like over 30,000 words. So I knew that should probably be in the center of the book as kind of a weight. And then because Lady Antebellum and The Wild Ones both did similar things formally, I didn't want them right next to each other, right? I wanted them to kind of mirror each other in the book. So then once I kind of had that sorted out, then I had to go back and make sure they were and tweak them to really fit that arc of me moving away. So it was fluid, but that was the memoir piece was sort of the presiding factor.
I love that you're thinking about like formal rhythms too. I was wondering that the Lady Antebellum and the Wild Ones are like it's nice to see them kind of spaced the way they are for the form. It's cool to know.
I mean, Sarah, I would like to hear you talk a little bit about the ordering in the book. I mean, I get why the last one's the last one, like in that sense. And this is maybe a question that like Maddie is particularly interested in because she's doing some pretty weird formal stuff with some of the essays, which I think has presented, presents complications in terms of trying to figure out how to motivate the reader through the reading experience and how to connect them and connect them, both with each other and with the other essays in the book. How were you thinking about that as like this came together?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question and something, I took the collections class at Arizona that has made me think differently about. I think one idea that came from that class that I think maybe Ander said was put your best stuff first, then like some weak stuff in the middle, then like the best stuff again at the end. So they have this like, the reader has this experience across I don't want to misquote you, Ander. That was like something I ended up thinking about. I also, there was like another rule I had. Oh, at one point I was like, I definitely have to have an odd number of essays in my book. Like there's no way I'll go for an even number. I don't know, there's like a whole tarot way of thinking about this, but I don't think I would have chosen The New Age Below Ground as the first. I think it was really Carol Pagel, the heaviest hand she had in this book, like the things that I didn't argue with and she sort of made her decision was the ordering. That really was, and so she decided for Signal to go last and New Age to go first. And then the other ones are almost chronological. So they appear as time passed in the way that time was working. So I think I did think about like the beast and the nest, and like there is kind of like a slide you might like if this is an obstacle course, there's like a slide you experience when you get to the nest, and it's not visual, but there's like a lot of internal play happening. So I think Maddie, like if you're thinking about that and there's form involved, it might be most fun to consider like where the hurdles are for the reader and where to place them, and then give them like moments to chill in the middle, and also contextual information, like what I guess I could call a memoir in my book. Like it's important maybe that the history of my family's house comes very early because that's addressed often. And then I think I liked putting the Foul Shoots essay later because it has a lot of callbacks to that and kind of makes this like full circle sensation happen before the last piece. So feels like you might think a little more like a poet if you've got some wild forms about arrangement and pacing on a large scale.
That's great. I'm going to throw out another question, which is sort of related, but it has to do with the way in which I'm wondering if both of you would talk kind of briefly about the ways in which the book changed in response to kind of editorial or publishing demands. Because I mean, in some ways, I mean, Sarah, you and I talked about this. So, I mean, it's hard to imagine like a lot of presses are just like not interested at all, or like it's just gonna be too expensive or just too hard to take on. And any press is going to have their own kind of like set of priorities, whether they're design or distribution or like, I mean, however you editorial. And to talk a little bit about how you navigated that movement between this thing that you'd created and often like published in individual places and what they could do or what, and maybe perhaps they were willing to do. I know Bethany has a story behind this too. We don't need to get super deep into that if you don't want to, but I think
no, I'm happy to.
Hear.
I just feel like there is like the experimentalist here. I want to give her all the room. She's got all the like juicy tidbits, I think. Yeah, there was some real shifting with mine. I think mostly around the footnotes. They just, as I felt really clear that University of Nebraska was the right fit for this book. when I was writing it, I sort of pictured it there because I think I'd read so many of their books in researching it, and they've been really formative for me at that point in my writing life. So I was so delighted when it found a home there. And it's still like, when you look at the series that it's a part of, it feels very at home there to me. They just have a really staunch policy about they don't do footnotes. And that was the only issue. They really wanted me to change the title, and I wasn't opposed to that, but I was like, I can't think of anything better. Can you guys? And we couldn't. So I was like, okay, like I kind of won the title battle, if you will. And then we got to the footnotes, and they were gone. And I was like, guys, there was a whole narrative thread through this book at the bottom, and where did it go? And they put them all as endnotes, which when you have something like 200 of them just feels prohibitive. So I felt really strongly, like, talk about an obstacle. I just couldn't conceive of a reader who would be willing to flip that much. And I couldn't envision it that way. So I couldn't find a way that made sense. If design is writing, if form is attached to meaning, I couldn't parse a meaning out of that. It just felt like a procedural thing that I couldn't sort out. So I cut a lot of the footnotes. I integrated a lot of them. I kept a few as endnotes. I could find like a certain rationale for that with a few of them. But then we got to the title essay, and I just felt so strongly that I wasn't going to incorporate or cut those notes, because as I talked about earlier, I only exist in that section, and I don't write memoir to not have myself in it. Just kidding. But so it was like very important to me that I have that space in the piece, because it was about my relationship to these women. And they really did try to meet me in that. They were like, we could make the footnotes really small type and insert them into each paragraph. And I was like, that feels wonky to me. And again, I lose all of the separation there, which is the point, right? So I had a really hard time selling them on the fact that the footnotes, the separation carried a lot of meaning, and I wanted to preserve that meaning. So we went back and forth a lot, and they met me with the side note, which, they made. I said, my first concern with side note was that it wouldn't look visually offset. It would be hard to tell what was happening here. So they made it gray, they changed the font. And this was like a great lesson in what is the point of your formal considerations? Because the point for me was that I exist separate from them, that I yield the stage. And I think we found a way to preserve that meaning. So we worked it out, but it was a little stressful for a minute.
And I mean, did you invent the side note? I mean, is that like, I've just never heard that term before.
Right, maybe. I feel like I have to give them, if we're claiming it as something that's been invented, then I should probably give them the rights to that, because it wasn't my idea, right? But yeah, I haven't seen it elsewhere, I'll say that.
I like
You
that.
can own it. So whenever anyone wants to write like their side note essay, they have to reckon with you like everyone else has to with David Foster Wallace if they try to do their footnote.
I was telling Bethany this too, but I actually really like them. I think that you're right that there's something about pace and proximity that it means the footnote should be close to the main text. And that is what they accomplished. And it's what you met them halfway, and that is retained, which I really appreciate. But I also just love the look of like the sort of blankness above the page beside. And it just makes it really easy to go back and forth, like maybe easier, I wager, than going below and then back up. So horizontalness.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I will say I was really thankful that they were willing to go so many rounds with me on that they were really able to do as much as they could within their rules. And while I never understood the rules, it felt a little bit like being a teenager. Like, I don't know why I have to be home by 10 o'clock, but at least you're letting me take the car, right?
I guess I'll try to answer pretty briefly, but with Bright Archive, the press I worked with, I didn't learn until after the book was like nearly done. The editor was like, yeah, you're the first book of essays we've ever done. And I was like, what? Like, how can that be? But I guess all the other people, like I would certainly call other books that I had made books of essays or book length essays, but all of those people identify as poets and so call their work poetry. So I think that informed the sensibility they used to approach this text for sure, and its forms, of course. But yeah, so that was, I mean, that surprised me, and I guess I sort of felt like I felt sort of like traditional at that point. I was like, oh, I guess I still call them essays. It's funny to I feel like I experienced that in my making life. Like, when I walk into one room, I'm like the weird artist person. I walk into another room and I'm like the scholar. So it's funny to wear different hats. But mostly these, it was like a big collaboration between myself and the editors and the designers at Rescue. And our question was essentially like, not what's allowed, but what is kindest to the eyes of the reader. And often Carol Pagel, like when I had designed these myself, they're pretty like really close to what I had wanted them to be, or I had them be initially, but often I went for like a compression of the text in the center of the page or within a shape. So like not double space, single space, and within an orb. And Carol would be like, let's make that double space. And I sort of like grumbled about it. But now that I see it in its book form, like I really see how the consistency of spacing, the font being the same size throughout, the margins being the same size throughout, it's really important. And it adds to like what is accessible about reading this book. So that I think was good. It was just nice to have someone who understood the object of a book talk to me about these becoming that, because I guess I really hadn't been thinking. I always wanted them to be a book, but everything I wrote resisted binding, which was funny to notice about my stuff. I guess it feels important for me to also say, I don't think I've shared this before, but that I was sending essays out after the MFA, and there were 2 occasions when the essay was accepted by a publication that I was really excited about. Like I'd been wanting to get into that publication for a long time. And in both instances, this was like 2 years apart, the editor was like, great, we want to publish the text, but not the form. And it was like a long story for each occasion, but in both instances, I guess I was being, and I love the word brat now that Claire used it in the alumni reading, but I think I was being kind of a brat. But I also like, I'm sort of proud of myself for ultimately in both instances being like, no, you can't have just text. Now I'm like, it could be cool to have that publication and then I could just do it in the book. But I think there's something about me being that way that ensured that I kept working in these forms and that they did make it to the book form. So yeah, and I mean, I don't know. I think I love talking to Bethany because we both have these books that are like a decade old. Like when we read from them, it's like a decade ago, our voices coming out of our older bodies. I really feel that sometimes. And part of that certainly is that I think that presses were wary of this many forms, you know, especially me. I don't know, not everyone has a designer who's like down to figure something out and put a lot of hours in, which is what Rescue's designer ended up doing. And that you know, that translates to money, that translates to labor costs. And yeah, so it was very collaborative with Rescue. I think I was lucky to find them. I think I was really sold on them when they were like, we're going to do every form. We're going to put a poster in it. That was important to me. So it's a little bit of the story.
Can I ask just one quick question? So like in the not essay, which I was looking at, I was kind of rereading and I assigned to my grad students from the PDF that you'd sent before. What I'm curious about is, and maybe I'll share the screen because it would be easiest to see what I'm talking about here. So you can see like this is the last line of the collection or of like the not essay in the PDF I have. And notice how like this not, it looks very similar to the one in the book, but it's not the same. This one ends up. It is a little bit of a kind of like lift up, and the one in the PDF ends down. And I'm wondering if you would talk about, I don't know, the decision, just like that small decision to kind of end that essay very slightly differently?
I'm so lucky to be in this conversation. Thank you for this question. Yeah, so the designers, so the knot you showed on screen was mine. I had made it in the Photoshop program, and this is the one the designers ultimately did. So they did a lot of repurposing of those forms, and this one does end, you could say, on an unstressed form when the other one is on a stressed form. So I think, yeah, we did talk about that, and I think sometimes I think that they were making choices that were easy on the reader's eye that affected what I would consider like the way form communicates tone or meaning. And sometimes I think they were like intending for that. So I think in this one, it did, like I did mention, it felt like more of a conclusion, right? Like a downbeat at the end than like this lift up. And I think that it feels different for the reader who cares about that at the end of this piece. And I don't know, I think I like both ways, but there's something I like that feels more conclusive about that shape at the end in the book. Good question. There's a lot of things like that that change just a little from the pearls have more of a white border around them. They're not really compressed with the line. And similarly, the soffits have their space inside the shape, not just text. So readability was priority.
Thanks, that's great. I think we're probably at a natural endpoint here since we've got blown past our hour a little bit in our zest for talking about form and architecture. So I'll end with thank you to the both of you for coming to join us. Also a note to buy these books. Like if you have not bought the books, you should buy the books because both of these books are really good and very singular and I think really exciting. And I really enjoyed them both. And I hope that they get into as many people in many people's hands as possible. Two more notes before we close. One is just a reminder that we will have the next in this series will be November 30th with Katie Standifer and Kelly Sundberg. And we're looking forward to talking about that and also talking more about like essays to books. At that point, you can find that on the Essay Daily page, which is essaydaily.org. And if you click on one of the things on the side, it's the Salon page. So we'll be doing a couple of these in the spring also. We'll be doing an event with Nicole Walker, who has a new book coming out about meat and meats, and Matthew Gavin Frank, another really interesting essayist who's got a book coming out. It's a really beautiful book about diamonds in the spring, and a few more things to come. And then the last thing is to mention that coming up, starting shortly after Thanksgiving, Essay Daily begins its Advent calendar. We didn't do it last year because we did our What Happened On project, I believe, during that time, but we're going to do an Advent calendar again, in which if you come to essaydaily.org every day during Advent, there'll be a new essay. So if you're interested in reading along with us and opening a new essay every day, which you should be, you should come and join us. If you are interested, if you want, I know a lot of you in the audience, and if you're interested in writing one, feel free to let us know. There's 27 or 25 slots. I don't know how long Advent is this year. We'll go by the official count. But, and again, thanks for all coming together and talking with us about essays and form and function and difficulty and cheese. We'll see you next time, and go buy some books. I hope you all are well. MFA oil, they're pressing MFAs for oil these days. So ciao.